Hello, everyone. I'm David Bodorf, Executive Director of the Association of Indiana Counties. I want to thank you for tuning in and watching our video today. This is a great presentation that we have lined up for you today. Our Board of Directors last year decided to do a property tax study, find out what type of trends have happened the past few years, what's happening with assessed value growth and levy growth, then to do a projection going forward. And we also wanted to do this analysis based because we knew the General Assembly was looking at changes in the business property tax system. Wanted to see what kind of effects that may have on local budgets. So our Board of Directors decided to hire Policy Analytics. With us today is David Reynolds. And David used to be the Senior Fiscal Analyst for the Senate Republican staff. He's been a city controller. He's also worked in the State Budget Agency. So he knows quite a bit about state budgets and local budgets as well. Then we also have with us Dr. Larry DeBoer. Many of you know Dr. Larry DeBoer. He was a professor at Purdue University and Indiana's expert on property taxes. So we're very fortunate to have these two gentlemen do this presentation today. We hope that you'll share this video with every member in the courthouse and actually share it with other public policymakers in your community, because it's great information that we've accumulated for you. With that, I'll turn this over to David Reynolds.
Thank you, David. It's great to be here, and thank you to the Association of Indiana Counties for asking Policy Analytics to participate in this study, and we're certainly very privileged to have Dr. Larry DeBoer partner with us in this project. Policy Analytics is an Indianapolis, Indiana-based company specializing in economic research, strategic planning, and fiscal and economic policy. Using Policy Analytics' proprietary model, property tax model, Dr. DeBoer and Policy Analytics examined the property tax burdens over a 10-year period, identified the property tax revenue capacity of the units of government, and identified the sensitivity of property tax revenues when business personal property is no longer taxed. There are some limitations to this analysis. Business personal property tax filings are self-reported and confidential. So under the scope of this engagement with the AIC, the analysis modeled the fiscal impact for the 100% elimination of taxation of business personal property. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. DeBoer.
Well, thank you, David, and David, both Davids. I'm pleased to be with you here today. I'd like to point out it is February 22nd, 2022, on a Tuesday. And we should mark this historic event because, as we've learned, it's probably be centuries before it happens again. So let's start off with a brief history of property taxation in Indiana. And, you know, how brief a history? Property tax goes back all the way till before the founding of the state of Indiana. But let's begin where the modern history of the property tax begins, I think you'd say, and that was the Town of St. John case. That was the Indiana Supreme Court decision that tossed out the old true tax value system of assessing property and instead gave us a new assessment standard, which is objective measures of property wealth. And that kicked off in 1998 when the decision took place. That kicked off more than a decade of what I like to call property tax policy chaos. And many of you remember that there were some years where counties and other local governments didn't actually get their property tax bills out, and special legislation had to be passed as to what you do in cases like that. Here is a list of some of the changes, just some of the changes that were made over the decade when the state and the policymakers started dealing with the consequences of this Supreme Court decision. Of course, there was a new assessment standard, and it meant that we went to market value in use. And so it's market value, basically selling prices or replacement cost or reproduction cost, less depreciation. Capitalization as well is used, but in use means assessing the property in its current use, not speculating on what it would bring in other uses. We introduced trending to keep assessed values up year after year with what was happening to selling prices and changes in costs. We put in large deductions for homeowners, and I mean large deductions for homeowners, less than half of the gross assessed value of homes are actually taxed in Indiana now, but that's a $45,000 standard deduction and a 35% supplemental deduction. And that was done mainly because the big effect, the really serious effect of the reassessment under the new market value and use system caused a very large shift in taxes towards homeowners. The legislature felt that homeowners should be defended from that tax increase. The base rate of farmland, it used to be a number, the starting point for assessment of an acre of farmland used to be a number that was negotiated between the old state tax board and farming interests. Supreme Court, of course, said, nope, that's not objective measure of property wealth, so now we use a capitalization formula and we adjust it each year. We trend the base rate of farmland too. Maximum levy growth quotient was changed. Used to be the assessed value growth quotient. Used to be based on the assessed value of individual jurisdictions and how that assessed value changed. But now it's a 6-year average of non-farm income growth statewide. The idea being that the statewide property tax bill should not grow any faster than the ability to pay of Indiana residents measured by their non-farm incomes. We eliminated the property tax on inventories and the school general fund property tax and county welfare fund property taxes. We invented several new local income tax credits for property tax relief, and to top it all off, passed a constitutional circuit breaker cap into the Indiana Constitution, and that put tax caps on total tax bills. Suffice it to say, the property tax system we have now is a very different animal than the one that we had in 1998-4. This idea of eliminating personal property from the tax base comes up fairly frequently. I remember studying it back in 2014, and here it came up again. Why is that? Why does that idea keep coming up? And there is actually a kind of logical sequence that makes it the next in line for the narrowing of the property tax base. So originally, 1851 Constitution, everything, all property, the value of all property was in the property tax base. But we began chipping away at that in the 1960s. Used to be that household property was assessed, meaning your carpet and your couch and your radio and all that stuff was assessed and taxed under the property tax. And that meant either you had to make a list of your property and turn it into the assessor, or the assessor would knock on your door and walk through your house and assess your living room table or your dining room table. We eliminated that with a constitutional amendment in 1966. We eliminated the tax of intangibles. Stocks and bonds and that sort of thing. In 1970, automobiles used to be taxed with a property tax, and that was eliminated in 1970 and replaced with the motor vehicle excise tax. Heavy vehicles were eliminated in 2000, and you may remember inventories being eliminated from the tax base in 2007. Now, what do all of these things have in common? An economist would look at those and say, these are all mobile tax bases. Now, some of them are literally mobile. Automobiles and heavy vehicles are mobile, and that makes it difficult to assess them. Gee, the assessor came by and somehow my car wasn't in the driveway. A little bit easy to avoid that sort of tax, and so we now tax them with the motor vehicle excise tax with registrations, which makes it much more difficult to avoid. But in a larger sense, what we mean by mobile is the tax base affected by the tax? Are the decisions that consumers and households and especially businesses make affected by the existence of the tax? And inventories are the best example of this. If you've been around long enough to remember when inventories were part of the property tax, you'll remember that in February, right now, we would have been seeing tax sales. And what was happening was that the auto dealers and other retailers were selling off their inventory so that on March 1st, the assessment date, it would be absolutely as low as possible. And then they'd rebuild their inventories in March. And not only did this make the administration of the property tax a little more difficult in that we were certainly not taxing the full value of normal inventories during the year, for an economist, you look at that and you say, wait a minute, here's a business making a business decision for no other reason than to avoid taxes. And, we like to see businesses making business decisions for business reasons based on efficiency, cost, and that sort of thing. Well, let's look at what's left in our property tax base. How mobile, the economics sense, how mobile are these parts of the property tax base? Well, land is the very definition of an unmobile tax base. You can tax land all you want, and the land is still there. Buildings are also pretty much not mobile. Yeah, you might make a decision as to whether to build or not, but once the building is in the ground, it pretty much stays in the ground. So putting taxes on buildings and land, on real property, not much in a way of decision-making affected by business, by households. Business equipment is different. Business equipment is the most mobile part of the tax base that remains. And business equipment, of course, you can decide whether to make the investment, you can decide whether to expand, you can decide whether to pick it up and move it somewhere else. Business decisions can be affected from the tax. We're talking about business equipment. And so when people look at what's in the tax base, look at where it was and where it is now, they say, what's the next one up? Equipment. Next one up to be considered for elimination. Well, it turns out that that can be done as a result of an amendment in 2004. Said the General Assembly may exempt from property taxation any property in any of the following classes. And one of the classes is taxable personal property other than property being held as an investment. And here it is, actually, the Indiana Constitution, Article 10, Section 1, C2. You see C, it says the General Assembly may exempt from property taxation any property in any of the following classes, and there it is, tangible personal property. So it's perfectly okay as far as the Constitution is concerned to eliminate or limit taxation, property taxes on tangible personal property. All right, let's take this opportunity here to take a look at what's been happening to the property tax burden and what we think, Policy Analytics and I think is likely to happen to the property tax burden over the next 5 years. So here we go, 2017 to 2021. These are numbers in the books. We know what's happening. Let's take a look. Let's start with the maximum levy growth quotient. This is a little chart that I use to show what happens to the maximum levy growth quotient over the years. Now, the bars that you see there are the growth rates of the Indiana non-farm personal income. You can see in 2021, it was 7.8%, so very rapid growth in income in 2021. The line that you see there, the golden line there, is the 6-year average with a 2-year lag. So the number that we know, that is the maximum levy growth quotient for 2022, 4.3%, was calculated using numbers most recently 2020 and then 19, 18, 15. So 2015 through 2020 were the 6 years that were averaged together to come up with 4.3%. Now you notice that it's going up. We're expecting it to rise, and the projections that we use in the analysis show it rising. We've got it going up all the way to 4.6% in 2026. Now we already know what 2021's income growth was. That's already in the books. We've got a report on those numbers already. But it hasn't been included in the maximum levy growth quotient, won't be included until 2023. So a prediction that the maximum levy growth quotient will go up in 2023 is a pretty good one. We'll be dropping out 2015, which was 4.7, and adding in 2021, which is 7.8. So maximum levy growth quotient, very likely to go up. The rest of these were based on the income growth rates that are included in the state revenue forecast. And it's predicting further increases in income, no recession in the offing as far as we can tell. And that means that maximum levy growth quotient is likely to remain in the mid 4% range over the course of the next few years. So maximum levy growth quotient, of course, is the amount that your maximum levy can from one year to the next. Discovered in looking at the data here that about 60% of all units in Indiana tax right at their maximum, within 99% of their maximum, and about 75% tax within 5% of their maximum levy. So most of your units out there taxing at the maximum levy growth rate shows you how much your levy can go up from one year to the next. So how are levies increasing? Well, the blue bars here are what happened from 2013 to 17, and the green bars are 17 to 21. In total, as you can see, the growth rate increased. Well, the growth rate, the maximum levy growth rate over the second half of this happened, so that helps explain that. But another reason why that happened is because referendums became very popular with school corporations. referendum funds were increasing pretty rapidly from 2013 to 17, but increased really rapidly from 17 to 21, as you see. Debt and lease funds have not been increasing very much, and all others, those are the ones most subject to the maximum levy growth quotient, growing at about 4.2%. That's a little bit higher than the average maximum levy growth quotient that period of time. Well, here are the growth rates in the levy, total levy by unit type, and the counties there, all the way to the left. And you can see the counties growing about 3.8 and then 3.9%. Well, where's the big growth coming? Well, that's with the schools, of course, 5.3% over the second half, 2017 to 21. And that's because the schools are the units that are using the referendums. Referendums outside of the maximum levy growth quotient, outside of the maximum levy restrictions, and they were growing very rapidly, 2017 to 21. You see cities and towns growing 4.1 and 4.2, counties growing a little bit slower than the cities and the towns. Well, what about it from the taxpayers' point of view? And the taxpayers, we've got pay 2017 and pay 2021, and we've got these colored bars here indicating taxpayers of different kinds, owning different sorts of property. We've got the residential, apartments, agricultural, commercial, industrial, and personal property on the top. And this shows the total. And if you take a look at those numbers there, you can see that the total is going up from a little bit less than $7 billion to a little bit more than $8 billion over those 4 years, and that every type of property is paying a higher tax bill, has a higher tax liability, except for agriculture. Agriculture actually went down over that period of time. Now, as it turns out, for the analysis, it's kind of useful to know the percentage shares in the total, not just the total numbers. So let's look at the percentage shares. Now, this is out of a total of 100%. And what you see here, and let me take a look at my notes here, and what you see is that the percentages of residential have gone up from 42.5% to 45.6%. And so residential share of the tax burden is growing. Residential tax bills rising faster than other tax bills. You can see that apartments are going up as well, agriculture's share going down, commercial property also going down, and personal property and industrial property remaining about even with the total. And so residential share going up, apartment share going up, commercial and agricultural over this period of time going down. Well, here you can see the percentage changes in liabilities by property type, the total going up 4.5%, residential and apartments rising the most at 6.3 to 7.3, agriculture down 2.3%, and commercial up a little bit, 2.9%, industrial and personal property growing about the same as the total. So what's causing this? Well, in the total, of course, the maximum levy growth quotient. The average increase 3.8, and then you add the school referendum funds, and that's an extra 0.9% from that. But for these others, for the shares of the property types in the total, here's where national and even global trends become local. Residential. What's going on with residential? Well, we know that from 2017 to 21, home prices in Indiana grew more rapidly than they have in quite literally decades, rising very rapidly. So what's going on there? Why is that happening? Well, household formation was going on. People were forming families and wanting houses. Of course, that was continuing. Incomes were rising. It was the second half of the longest expansion in American history. Mortgage rates remained historically low. And yet somehow home construction lagged. Home construction in Indiana and in many other places never recovered from the Great Recession. So you've got all these things like rising incomes and low mortgage rates causing increases in demand, and the supply didn't keep up. Well, what happens when you get demand rising, supply not so much? Prices going up. And when prices go up, the value of the property is higher. The property tax is a tax on the value of property. If the value of your property goes up, property taxes go up. Apartments, likewise, a little bit less construction on apartments, but also if homes are expensive and scarce, you got to live somewhere. That keeps a demand for apartments growing as well. Agriculture, well, the agricultural assessed values and tax liabilities are mostly on land, and land is assessed based on the base rate. Now, the base rate of farmland depends in large part on the prices that farmers are getting for corn and soybeans. And back in 2013 to 14, the prices of corn and soybeans crashed, and they remained low throughout this period of time from 2015 through 2019 and into 2020. Soybean and corn prices remained low, and as those prices were gradually inserted into the formula, the 6-year average formula for the base rate of farmland, the base rate of farmland came down. It was $2,050 per acre in 2015. It got down to, I think, $1,280 for taxes payable this year. So that caused the decline in the agricultural property taxes. How about commercial? Well, commercial share of the burden is going down as well, and I would put that down probably to the ongoing decline of brick and mortar retailers due to rising internet sales. Internet sales, of course, rising very rapidly over the course of the expansion of the 20-teens and replacing, to some degree, the taxable, property taxable land and real property of commercial buildings and sellers. All right, well, what do we think is going to happen to the property tax burden into the future? Take a look at some trends and put those trends into the policy analytics model. Policy analytics model includes every unit of government in Indiana and also every taxpayer in Indiana. So this is a major piece of big data programming to make these things work. So what do we think is going to happen? Well, first of all, here's what we think is going to happen to the liabilities. And the dashed or cross-hatched bars that you see there are what we saw from 2017 to 21, and the solid ones are what we're expecting from 21 to 26, and these are average annual changes. And so we see that the total going up from 4.5% and then to 4.6%. Now, the maximum levy growth quotient is rising into the mid-4s, and it's going to be higher by about a percentage point than it was before. So why didn't that go up more? One of the reasons is that we are not trying to predict. We wouldn't have the chutzpah to predict school referendums, right? What would it take? We'd have to figure out which school corporations are going to propose referendums and then figure out which ones would win. I've tried that, actually, and you can't do it. not with aggregate data, these are local elections based on local circumstances. So we didn't assume any new referendums. There might be more referendums, in which case that number would increase more. On the other hand, last 3 elections, we've only seen, I think, 7 school referendums, and before that we were seeing 10 to 20 a year. So the number of referendums have really dropped off over the last few years. So at any rate, that's what's happening to the total. We see residential going up more rapidly, apartments going up a little bit less rapidly, but still rising fast. Agriculture shifting from a decline to a rather large increase. Well, what's going on there? Well, I'll tell you what's going on. Price of corn, price of soybeans suddenly went up during the pandemic. And as those new higher values enter into the base rate formula, replacing the old lower values in the base rate formula, the base rate of farmland go up. And the DLGF has already identified the base rate of farmland for taxes payable in 2023 at $1,500, a 16% increase. So this is going to happen. We can be sure of that. Commercial, you see, growing a little more slowly, and industrial and personal property growing more slowly as well. What about the liabilities? What about the taxpayers? What's happening to them? Well, again, increases, and this time, over this period of time, you see it going up from about $8 billion to about $10 billion. So that's a 25% increase over 5 years. But maximum levy growth quotient, 4.6%, compounded over 5 years, that's about what you get. And so we expect that the property tax levy will approach $10 billion by the time we get to pay 2026. The liabilities on all of the different taxpayer types there, all the different kinds of property, going up. What about the percentages, though? Well, once again, we've got the percentages of the residential continuing to rise, rising from 45.6% in pay 2021, which is a number in the books, all the way up to 51% in pay 2026. So homeowners, residential property owners, paying a little bit more than half of the total tax liability by 2026 under these expectations, under these projections. Agriculture's share going up, commercial property share coming down further, and the shares of personal property and industrial coming down as well. Now, some of these reductions for everybody but residential is simply because residential is increasing so much, and it only can add up to 100%, and so one is going up a lot, the other has to come down. But there are other reasons as well. What are we seeing as we look forward to trends in personal property liabilities, tax liabilities, 2021 to 2026? Well, of course, this is speculation. When we look back, we know what happened or what the causes were for what we saw. But speculating, well, we know that the maximum levy growth quotient will increase next year and will probably be higher going forward, maybe in the 4.5 range. When you look back at what happened in 2020 and 2021, residential values, home values have been rising even more rapidly than they did in the second half of the 2010s. So home values everywhere, including Indiana, going up very rapidly. We know that agricultural commodity prices started to increase and that will increase the base rate of farmland. And then in addition to the retail apocalypse, to the decline in brick and mortar retail stores with internet shopping, we've also now got the possibility that working at home, working remotely will become more standard than it used to be as businesses got that experience during the pandemic. And that might mean that the values of commercial office space will grow more slowly or could even decline. So we put these trends into the model to try to figure out what might happen. All right, let's take a look at property tax revenue capacity. And this means that under the rules, how much can you actually raise from the property tax? And of course, we've got two major property tax limitations out there. We've got the maximum levy, which takes place during the budget process, and we've got the property tax circuit breaker caps, which are applied to the tax bills that the taxpayers pay. Well, here's the unit by unit percentage of maximum levy that is actually levied, raised by the different sorts of units. And what we see, if you take a look at school corporations and library districts and cities and towns, you see we're up at 94, 96, 98%. These are units that are mostly taxing right at or very near their maximum levies. Townships a little lower. Counties, as it turns out, have the most room under the maximum levies. They're taxing at 83% of their maximum levy. When we take a look at the property tax caps, though, we see this. Here we have the three categories of property tax circuit breaker caps. And what we've done here is to say, all right, what is the size of the pie as far as the maximum potential property tax bills that can be charged? We did was say, okay, how about we take 1% of all the homestead property values, plus 2% of all the non-homestead residential and farmland property, plus 3% of all the business, real, and personal property, and add that up and say, well, that's the maximum pie that can be collected. And then take a look at each unit. How much are you actually collecting? Well, as you can see for homesteads, residential farmland, and business, real, and personal, it's gone up a little bit from 2017 to 2021, but we're expecting it to decline some when we get to 2026. Declining simply because the value of homes and assessed value generally going up a little bit more rapidly than they did in 2021, and that increases the tax cap amounts, since they are percentages of assessed value. We see that the 2% category for rental housing mostly and farmland is right now up at about 95.7%, the homesteads at 91.6%, and the most room we've got is in that 3% category, business, real, and personal property at 75%. Well, One way to look at this, and one useful way to look at this, is to divide the data up, divide the counties up into three different classifications. What's the difference between urban and rural? And so here's a classification that I like to use. This was done by Janet Ayers and Brigitte Waldorf, who are professors in the Agricultural Economics Department, where I used to work. Long may it wave. And they took some data and did some surveys and classified all of our counties into three categories: urban, rural, and then a third category, mixed. Now, urban, I mean, you can see them. You got Lake and Allen and Marion and Hamilton and Vandenberg, of course, the usual suspects for urban counties. Rural, as you look, you can see, of course, Benton and White and Warren, and up there in that agricultural region there are classified as rural. Mixed is the difficult one. Mixed is, obviously it's got a lot of farmland in it, but they've also got a good-sized town. Mixed, I think, may be exemplified by Bartholomew County. Columbus is a pretty good-sized place, but there's an awful lot of farmland in Bartholomew County as well. So that's what mixed is. So suppose we add up the categories that we've got, add up the property tax numbers that we've got into urban, mixed, and rural categories. And what do we see? What we see is, when we say, hey, the 1% and the 2% are taxing up at 90% or more of the property tax liability, that is an urban phenomenon. I think this is often true, that when rural folks look at the statewide totals of the property tax, they often think, well, that doesn't look like us. Well, no, it doesn't. Urban tends to dominate the property tax data. And what we see is it actually taxing above 100% of the maximum amount. Now, how is that? Well, that's because of the referendums, right? The referendums are outside of the property tax caps, and so you can actually tax more once you take the count. Still, there's some room even in urban counties in the 3% category. When we look at mixed and rural, though, quite a bit of room. Not taxing the maximum all the slices of the pie, actually at 77 and 82.6 and 67, as you see, in the mixed counties, and less than that even in the rural counties. So it's urban counties that are right up against their maximums as far as the tax cap credits are concerned. Well, here is a map that shows where the counties are that are taxing closest to their maximum. You can see the scale there is percent of maximum, and the darkest counties are the ones that are closest to the maximum. And just as you'd expect, given that urban bar chart that we just saw, it's the urban counties that are really close to the maximum. They are taxing nearest to the maximum possible property tax under the circuit breaker limits. Rural counties are lightly colored, and they're less than 60%, some of them, and under 80%, almost all of them. All right, now let's talk about the policy simulation that we did, the elimination of business personal property taxes. And again, let me emphasize here that what we did was to say, what would happen if we just chucked the whole thing? We just eliminated all business personal property taxes. And in the model, all you have to do in order to run the model, and I say all you have to do, realizing the years of work it took to develop this model, but all you have to do is zero out the assessed value of personal property and then rerun all of the maximum levy limits and the circuit breaker caps and the rates changes and all of that stuff. Rerun all of that, assuming that levies are unchanged, and see what happens. So that's what we're going to do with this. Now, you know, early on last fall, there was some talk about total elimination of business personal property taxes. That is not the bill that is still alive. However, whatever happens, if, in a sense, my prediction is true that this idea of eliminating business personal property will continually come up into the future, having a kind of baseline of what would happen if you got rid of all of it might prove useful. So let's take a look at what would happen if you eliminated business personal property taxes. Well, first of all, let's take a look at the important things that matter for the effect of the elimination of business personal property taxes. And one of them is how important is personal property in your county's tax base. And so here's a map that shows which counties have the highest shares of personal property in their tax base. And it's an interesting map, I think, because it kind of shows where Indiana's energy resources are. Look at the southwest there. That's where the coal is, and that's where the big power plants got built. Now, a lot of them are moving away from coal-fired to natural gas-fired. Nonetheless, that's still where they are. And utility property, yeah, there's some land, yeah, there's a shell building around it, but almost all utility property is enormous machinery inside that building. And where you've got one of those great big power plants, it tends to make up a large share of your tax base. So you look down there at Pike and Hudson and Knox. Those are the places where you have those kinds of power plants. And then where's the other place, the other region where we see a high share of personal property? That's that stripe across the northern part of the state, all the way from Benton out to Jay. Those are the wind turbines. That's that river of wind that runs across Indiana that we are mining with the wind turbines. So you got wind turbines in there, and that adds a lot of personal property to your tax base. Especially in rural counties, this can turn out to be a very large share of the total. So where do we see the biggest amounts of personal property as a share of total assessed value? It's in places where there are utilities. So utilities important when we talk about elimination of personal property taxes. Well, here is another chart that again shows the estimates for 2021, or the actuals for 2021, divided up by urban, mixed, and rural. And these are the total dollar property tax liabilities. You remember that the total was $8 billion for the year 2021. And we divided up urban, mixed, and rural. And in urban, the total is about $5.5 billion. This is another reason why, when you look at state totals, they tend to reflect what goes on in the urban counties rather than in rural counties, because the 17 counties classified as urban under this classification absolutely dominate the totals of property tax liabilities. Way more than half of the total of property tax liabilities or property taxes paid take place in just those 17 urban counties. But it's much more interesting to look at the percentage shares. Now take a look at this right here, and let me make sure I can get the numbers here on my sheet. Okay, what do we see? Well, first of all, we see that residential is biggest in urban and smallest in rural. Now, you know, when you think of urban counties, you think of a lot of business, maybe some factories, certainly a lot of retail shopping and giant office buildings and all that stuff. So you think of business property, but you should also think of the fact that there's a lot of people in these urban counties, and the houses in these urban counties tend to be more expensive. And when you take those into account, what you see is that residential property in urban counties makes up a bigger share than it does in mixed in rural. When you look at agriculture, you get exactly what you would expect. It's a much bigger share in rural counties than it is in urban counties. I'm fond of saying that I was actually born in New York, grew up in a city area. I didn't know much about agriculture. I came to Indiana, but wandering around the College of Agriculture, I did learn one thing. Most farmland is not in cities and towns. And here's the data to show that my impression is actually right. Most of the assessed value and the tax liability for agriculture is in the rural and the mixed counties. Take a look at commercial. Now that's as you'd expect, bigger in urban counties and lower in rural counties. Now look at personal property. Personal property is biggest in the rural counties. And this is one of those facts I think that I learn anew every once in a while. I learn it and I go, oh. And then after a few years I forget it and I learn it again and I go, oh. And this is one of those things. Oh, personal property is a bigger share of rural county assessed value than it is of urban county assessed value, which means that rural counties are more vulnerable. Talk about the elimination of personal property. It would take a bigger chunk out of their tax base to eliminate personal property. Now, again, why is that? Well, yeah, the combines on the farms are big, expensive pieces of equipment, but most of the utility property is in rural areas, and that's why the share in rural counties is so big. Now, we've got an animated piece of, and as I said, it's animated. I'm thinking, I'm not sure if we're going to be able to animate it. Oh, we're not going to animate it, but you got to think in terms of animation. So squint at that top part of this chart. This is what happens under our system when a big chunk of the tax base gets eliminated. Now let's go back to 2007 when we eliminated inventory taxes, the property tax on inventories. That was about 8% of net taxes that were paid there. So we're going to take 8% of the tax and we're going to remove it. So what happens? Well, in Indiana and pretty much everywhere, you take the levy, the amount of revenue that we need to raise, and that is usually limited right at the maximum levy or very close to the maximum levy. We divide it by the net assessed value that gets reported from the assessor and then with the deductions from the auditor, and that gives us the tax rate. Now, if we eliminate a chunk of that net assessed value, and we don't change the levy, and that's how we modeled the thing, and that's also what happened back in 2007, the tax rate is going to go up. Well, if the tax rate goes up, then everybody pays higher tax bills, except the inventory tax owners. The inventory owners, they don't pay because their taxes were eliminated. So their tax bill disappears, and everybody else, homesteads, other residential, business, land, buildings, personal property, pays more as the tax rate goes up. So when we eliminate one chunk of the assessed value base, the taxes shift to everybody else, and everybody else pays more. Well, that's the way it was in 2007, but something pretty important happened in between 2007 and now, and that was this. The tax caps, the circuit breaker caps, were added to the Indiana Constitution. We've talked about this already, but I'll put this in because I like the drama. So between 2007 and now, tax caps in the Indiana Constitution. What does that do to a change in the tax base? Well, here it is. Once again, we're going to eliminate personal property taxes. It's about 17% of net taxes in 2021, so more than double the impact from the elimination of inventory taxes. We eliminate that part of net assessed value and tax rates go up. Everybody's tax rates go up, and that means that everybody's tax bill goes up. Except personal property doesn't go up because theirs are eliminated. So anybody who owns personal property is going to see their tax bill disappear. Everybody else's tax bill is going to go up, right? Because rates have gone up. But wait a minute. Some of those taxpayers are going to have their taxes capped. Some of them will rise to their caps and pay no more. Others are already at their caps, and so they don't have to pay any more. And so what happens to the tax bills of other taxpayers? Might go up some, but they won't go up, in total, won't go up as much as the lost tax bill from personal property. A smaller share of the levy is collected. Tax cap circuit breaker credits increase. Another way to say it is, hey, we've got a whole bunch, 17% of net taxes being paid by personal property owners. We're going to eliminate their tax payments. We're going to try to shift those taxes to everybody else, but some of those folks are at their caps and don't have to pay, so some of that tax bill can't be shifted, and that means revenue losses for local governments. All right. Now, here's the results of the analysis. And so let me get onto my paper here, and we will get the actual numbers, and you can take a look. Now, first thing I want you to look at is the top chart, and that's the average percent change in the net levy. So this is the revenue, the impact of elimination of personal property on revenue for local governments in 2026. And this is revenue after all the credits, after all maximum levy, after everything, right? This is how much is actually collected by local governments. Now, if you look down the left column there, it says business personal property as a percentage of total net assessed value. And this shows places that are less dependent on personal property taxes and more dependent, from less than 10% of your tax base net assessed value in personal property to more than 25%. And if you look on the rightmost column, the column labeled all, this is my distribution of counties, the 92 counties, into those 5 categories of business personal property. And as you see, the more personal property you've got, the bigger the loss of revenue will be. Loss of revenue is higher where there's more personal property on average, and this is an average of all the counties, than it is when less personal property. Well, that makes sense. If you're trying to shift more and you're running up against caps, you're likely to lose more. Now, if you look across the top there, the other category, the other determinant of what your revenue losses are likely to be is circuit breaker credits as a percent of the levy. And this is an attempt to measure how many of your taxpayers are already at their caps or close to their caps. So less than 2% circuit breaker credits as a share of the levy, you're losing hardly anything. That means most of your taxpayers are below the caps. 20% or more means you got a lot of taxpayers at their caps. And once again, if you look across the bottom there at the all column, you see that the bigger losses, the bigger revenue losses, are where more of your taxpayers are at their caps, minus 15.6% on average for counties that have more than 20% of their levy lost to circuit breaker credits. And what that means is, hey, no matter how much you're trying to shift to other taxpayers from business personal property taxpayers, no matter how much you try to shift, if you got people at their caps, they are not going to pay and you're going to lose that revenue. Now, what you see inside that table are the combinations of counties. And they are color-coded, and the darker the color, the darker the red there, the bigger the loss of revenue. And of course, in the lower left, or lower right of this table, you see the biggest losses. The most vulnerable counties are those that have a lot of personal property and a lot of taxpayers at their caps. There's a whole lot of revenue we'd like to shift to other taxpayers, but a lot of those taxpayers are already capped and will not pay more. That's when you lose a whole lot of revenue. When do you not lose revenue? Well, if there's not much to shift, but when you do shift it, tax bills for everybody else goes up because they're still below their caps. Then you don't lose revenue. Well, the second half of this chart shows the average percentage change is residential liability. So this is what's happening to your homeowners and your renters, what's happening to their tax bills. And once again, as we look down the column, we see from places that have less business personal property to places that have more business personal property. And across the right, just as you'd expect, the more business personal property that's trying to shift to your tax bill, the bigger your tax bill is likely to rise, the more it's likely to rise. And as you can see, the number there, 13.9% in counties on average that have 20% or more of their tax base in business personal property. However, if you're capped, that won't happen. And when you look across the top, you can see, again, off to the right are more taxpayers at their caps or near their caps. And as you move to the right on the all row there, you go from 10.5% down to 4.1%. That is, even if there's a whole lot of property trying to shift their taxes to you, if you are capped, you won't have to pay. And so when we have taxpayers at their caps, the taxpayers are protected from increases in tax bills due to the elimination of business personal property. Where are the biggest numbers on this chart? In the lower left, where you've got a lot of personal property and your taxes are below your cap. And so when the taxes shift, well, you pay. So those are the kinds of effects of business personal property on revenues for local governments and on taxes for homeowners. Remember, this is total elimination of personal property. That is not on the table here in 2022, but the pattern that you see right here, given these two determinants of what the impact on revenues and what the impact on tax bills will be, the pattern should be the same for any partial elimination. The numbers will be smaller, but the pattern is the same. Well, here's a map of the effect on revenues, the decrease in the net levy. And what do you see? Well, you basically see both urban areas getting bigger impacts, and we see places with a lot of personal property getting those impacts. So the stripe across the top where all the utility property is, all the wind turbines are. You've got some big counties there with losing revenue. In the southwest, you see counties losing revenue, and you see some somewhat moderate losses in the urban counties. They don't have as much personal property, of course, but they've got a lot of taxpayers, usually a lot of taxpayers at their caps. And the rural places that don't have utilities, they're the ones that are affected less. They don't have that much personal property, and they've got lots of taxpayers under their caps. Now, if we look at the residential tax liabilities, again, we see the southeast and the stripe across the north there having the biggest increases in their tax bills. A lot of taxes attempted to be shifted, a lot of utility taxes trying to shift, and a lot of taxpayers below their caps. If you take a look at the donut around Marion County there, you can see not much impact on taxpayers because a lot of those taxpayers are at their caps already, and there's not that much personal property as a share of the total assessed value in those counties. Now, the bill, House Bill 1002, excuse me, doesn't, of course, eliminate all personal property taxation. What it does is to eliminate the 30% floor in the future. And so we thought there might be one extra determinant that we might think of, and that is how fast is personal property growing in your county? Because it will be new personal property that will be allowed to depreciate more than personal property has been allowed to depreciate so far. We'll blitz right past that 30% floor down into the 25, 20, 15% range for new property. So eventually the new property assessed lower than it would have been under the 30% floor. If you're not getting any new personal property, well, you won't see much of an impact. If you have a lot of new personal property, you would see an impact. So all this chart does is to show where has personal property gross assessed value been growing since 2017. And not much of a pattern that I can recognize there. You've got some places growing fast. You've got some places growing more slowly. You've got some urban places growing more slowly, but some urban places growing a little more rapidly. But at any rate, you can take a look at your particular county and see where that growth is. Now, one thing, we talked about utilities. We've got a new utility coming online here in Indiana over the next several years, and those are the solar farms, the solar installations. And so those are the new utility properties that would be allowed to depreciate beyond 30% if utility and solar is included in that bill. So those would be the counties that would be vulnerable in the sense that they wouldn't end up collecting as much property tax from those facilities as they would have. And other taxpayers would not have seen as much tax relief from those solar facilities as they would have. Well, so what can we conclude? Business personal property tax elimination, greater revenue losses where business personal property is a larger share of assessed value and where many taxpayers are at their circuit breaker caps. Places with a lot of utility property where tax rates are above $2 or even above $3, those are the places that get hit. Bigger tax bill increases where business personal property is a large share of assessed value and taxpayers are below their circuit breaker caps. And so if you're in a place where you've got a whole lot of taxpayers under their caps, rural areas are like that, and have a lot of utility property or other kinds of business personal property, that's the place where the homeowners would get hit with the biggest tax bill increases. Rural and mixed counties are the ones with a large share of business personal property. That's kind of counterintuitive when we think about what these counties are, but that's the way it works out. And again, it's utilities amidst all that rural housing and farmland that make up a large share of their business personal property assessed value. The elimination of 30% floor on new investment should have the same pattern of effects as total elimination. That is, the things that matter are the share of business personal property in the total and how many taxpayers are near their caps. And counties with more rapidly growing business personal property would be affected more by the elimination of the 30% floor on new investment. Well, that's what I have to say. Thank you very much for listening. If you've made it all the way to the end here, brownie points for you. And it's been a great deal of fun to do this analysis. Working with policy analytics is terrific to actually have that marvelous model that they have of the property tax at our fingertips. So thank you to them, and thank you to the Association of Counties for the opportunity to do this analysis and do this presentation. Thanks very much.